member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak on Bill C-5, an act to amend the Criminal Code and the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. In the 6 years that I have been a member of Parliament, I have never seen a greater disconnect between how a bill has been advertised and what, in fact, is in the substance of the bill. The Liberals today have been doing a good job patting themselves on the back, touting Bill C-5 as landmark progressive legislation. This bill has been advertised as legislation that addresses systemic racism. They claim that it helps address Black, Indigenous, and marginalized groups who are caught up in Canada's criminal justice system. They claim that this bill helps persons who are suffering from drug addictions to stay out of jail and get the help that they need. Madam Speaker, if in fact the substance of the bill did what the Liberals have advertised the bill to be, it would be, indeed, a supportable bill, and I would submit it would be a laudable bill. The problem, Madam Speaker, is that this bill does none of those things. Simply put, Bill C-5 is not as advertised. Now let's unpack that for a moment. And in that regard, let's look at the issue and the claim that this bill supposedly helps persons who are suffering from addictions. Madam Speaker, I couldn't agree more that it is important to help persons suffering from addictions to get treatment, to be able to rehabilitate so that they can become a happy and contributing member of society again. And I certainly agree that when it comes to minor possession, it isn't appropriate in most circumstances to prosecute. And indeed, it historically has been rare for persons found with minor possession of drugs to be prosecuted solely on the basis of minor possession. And today, those prosecutions do not happen. And that, Madam Speaker, is because of a directive issued by the Public Prosecution Service of Canada that provides that in cases of minor possession, prosecutions shall not proceed except where there are public safety concerns. Madam Speaker, this bill doesn't change that. It is true that it codifies that in law, and that is fine. It is probably the only reasonable aspect of this bill, but it doesn't change the status quo, namely that today in Canada, persons are not charged and not prosecuted for minor possession. So then the question becomes, what exactly does this bill do for persons who are suffering from addictions issues? Well, Madam Speaker, when one actually picks up the text of the bill, one would be surprised that the Liberal solution to helping persons suffering with addictions is to help criminals who prey on persons suffering from addictions. Because what this bill does is roll back sentences for some very serious drug offenses. This bill rolls back mandatory sentencing for drug trafficking. It rolls back sentencing for the serious crime of importing and exporting drugs. Madam Speaker, I think any reasonable person can distinguish very clearly between drug trafficking and importing and exporting drugs compared to that of a vulnerable person who might be suffering from mental health issues or other issues, who happens to be caught with a small amount of drugs. There is a world of difference. And yet, for such a marginalized person, this bill does nothing to help them, but it does help drug dealers and drug pushers. Indeed, remarkably, one of the offenses that are rolled back in this bill is with respect to producers, manufacturers of Schedule I drugs, including hard drugs such as cocaine and heroin, as well as fentanyl and crystal meth. We have an opioids crisis in Canada today. Every day, approximately 20 Canadians lose their lives to an opioids overdose. It has increased by 88% since the onset of COVID. 7,000 Canadians a year. And this government's solution is to roll back mandatory sentencing for the very people who are putting this poison on our streets and endangering lives and killing 20 Canadians a day? Madam Speaker, if I were someone who was suffering with a drug addiction issue, and that was the solution that this government had to help me, I would say, I don't need your help. I don't want your help, because it is completely counterproductive. It is completely the opposite of what this government claims this bill is about. When it comes to supporting persons who are suffering from drug addictions, simply put, Bill C-5 is not as advertised. Now, Madam Speaker, what about the claim that this bill tackles systemic racism? That this bill really will help Black, Indigenous, and marginalized groups of Canadians? I know the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice spent some time on that topic this morning in his speech. Madam Speaker, there is absolutely nothing concrete in this bill to tackle systemic racism. There's absolutely nothing in this bill for Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized groups of Canadians. But what there is in this bill is the rolling back of some very serious firearms offenses. What kind of offenses? Well, Madam Speaker, we're talking about robbery with a firearm, extortion with a firearm, weapons trafficking, discharging a firearm with the intent to injure, using a firearm in the commission of a crime, and Madam Speaker, there are many other serious offenses that this bill rolls back. So, Madam Speaker, how does that help address systemic racism? How does that help Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized Canadians? The answer is it doesn't do anything. And I would submit, Madam Speaker, that it is outrageous. It is beyond shameful that this government has used vulnerable Canadians, marginalized Canadians, as cover for the real objective of this bill, which is to pursue a liberal ideological agenda of going soft on criminals. And, Madam Speaker, it is also ironic. It is ironic because we heard during the very recent federal election campaign a lot of rhetoric from the Liberals about firearms and how firearms pose a significant threat to public safety and to the security of our communities. And then, within 3.5 weeks of this House reconvening following the election, what does this government do? They introduce legislation not to get tough on firearms offenses, but to help people who go out, who use firearms, who put up people's lives at risk, to stay out of jail and in the community. But, Madam Speaker, it's hardly a surprise given the record of this government. We saw in the last Parliament when my former Conservative colleague introduced a private member's bill, Bill C-238, Bob Soroya, his private member's bill, Bill C-238. That bill would have increased penalties for persons who were convicted of knowingly being in possession of a smuggled firearm. Now, why is that an important bill? Well, if this government was serious about tackling firearms crime, they would recognize that 80% of firearms offenses in Canada are committed with a smuggled firearm. And so it would logically follow that a bill like C-238 would be welcome. But instead, one by one, the Liberals, with the help of the NDP, voted to defeat Bill C-238. Mr. Speaker, it shows that when it comes to actually coming up with solutions to tackle firearms crime, this government just simply is AWOL. But when it comes to firearms, I have to give them some credit, perhaps backhanded credit for being consistent. The Liberals have been consistently tough on firearms, tough on law-abiding firearms owners.
That's right.
That's when they really get tough. But when it comes to people who go out and commit crimes with firearms, oh no, it's a whole different story. The Liberals in that case are more interested in giving them a free pass. So it really highlights what a misplaced set of priorities this government has. We hear a lot of rhetoric over there about evidence-based decision-making. Going after law-abiding firearms owners, while at the same time rolling back sentences for people who commit crimes with firearms, is ideological decision-making, not evidence-based decision-making.
That's right.
Again, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-5, when it comes to helping marginalized, disadvantaged Canadians. It simply isn't as advertised. Now, Madam Speaker, the Minister of Justice, in the press release that he issued announcing the introduction of Bill C-5, was quoted as saying that serious criminals should face serious punishment and be separated from our communities. Madam Speaker, I couldn't agree more with the Minister of Justice with respect to his comment. But then, consistent with a bill that is not as advertised, when one opens up Bill C-5, one learns that this bill does exactly the opposite of what the minister claims to be concerned about, to say that we should keep serious criminals out of our communities. This bill drastically opens up conditional sentencing. Conditional sentencing orders for serious crimes, including kidnapping a minor, human trafficking, arson for a fraudulent purpose, aggravated assault with a weapon. Madam Speaker, what this bill means is that those convicted of those serious offenses may not have to spend a single day in jail. Instead, they would have an opportunity to serve their sentence in the community, maybe even next door to their victim. Now, for a minister who talks about the fact that serious criminals should face serious punishment, does the minister not consider arsonists, kidnappers, and persons convicted of sexual assault to be serious criminals? I would challenge him to go out and say that, because, Madam Speaker, I think any reasonable person would say that such criminals are serious criminals. They pose a threat to public safety, and they should be doing time behind bars and not out on the streets. Now, Mr. Speaker, for all of the ways in which this government has tried to sell this bill, what this bill is completely lacking is any support for marginalized Canadians. This bill does nothing to provide training or counseling or other supports. You know, we on this side of the House strongly believe in reducing recidivism. It was, in fact, a Conservative member of Parliament, the Honourable Member for Tobique-Mactaquac, who introduced Bill C-228 in the last Parliament, a framework to reduce recidivism. Mr. Speaker, this bill offers nothing in that regard. In closing, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-5 puts the rights of criminals first and the rights of victims last. It endangers public safety while doing nothing to help marginalized and vulnerable Canadians. And if the Liberals were honest and advertised this bill truthfully, they would advertise it as the soft-on-crime, do-no-time bill. This bill needs to be defeated.